Welcome to our Profiles in Leadership podcast series. And today we are thrilled to have Tim Holbrook, who is the former Vice Provost, Faculty Affairs at Emory University, and the Asa Giggs Chandler, a Professor of Law at the Law School. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here and looking forward to our conversation.
The focus of the podcast really is to invite leaders in the field like yourself to reflect on their professional journey, to share some nuggets of wisdom along the way. So let's start with your early life and education. Tell us, where did it all start?
Well, it all started in a small rural town in northeastern Ohio called Louisville, Ohio. And I had always thought that I would leave Ohio, just to be frank. My father had gone to North Carolina State for grad school. My sister was there, and I knew I wanted to be an engineer, I think, but I was also a high school debater. And so that's what led me to think about going to law school. So I went to college at North Carolina State thinking, if I have an engineering degree, I can go on to make money with that degree, or I can go to grad school, or if I don't like engineering, I can go to law school. And that got me to law school. I went to law school to study environmental law, but desperately needed a job after my first year of law school because I was heavily in debt. And a fraternity brother of mine said, look, I think North Carolina patent firms would be interesting in hiring a North Carolina State engineering alum as a first-year law student, particularly because I went to law school at Yale, so that had a little bit more sort of gravitas down there. So I kind of somewhat was lied and said I always wanted to do patent law, and I got a job in North Carolina doing patent work, and that pivoted my career. I was like, wow, this is actually fascinating, the law and economics, the technology. And so that's what took me onto the path of intellectual property, and particularly patent law. And in law school, at Yale, there's a bit of a pipeline to clerkships. Everyone does them. I didn't know what they were because I'm the only lawyer in my family, so I had no clue that this was important. One of the partners at the law firm I worked at in Charlotte, North Carolina, however, had clerked to the federal circuit and had recommended that I apply. And so that, again, applying to the federal circuit, I was thinking, well, it's a federal appellate clerkship, so that's great. And if I end up not liking patent law, it's still a federal appellate clerkship. And if I do like patent law, then I come off of this clerkship with a skill set that will help advance my career. At that time, thinking I was going to go into practice. Being an academic was never on my radar until I got to the court.
Yeah, let's pause there for a moment, because I think the clerkship part of it is an opaque aspect of, for many people, law students especially, both something they aspire to, but also a black box. So what was it like working with the judges, and what would you say were some of the takeaways, both in terms of the leadership skills that you saw on the court, but also what were your experiences as a law clerk at the court?
Yeah, I think the clerkship was possibly the best job I ever had, maybe second only to being a law professor, because you really get to work intimately with your particular judge at the federal circuit. And I clerked for the Honorable Glenn L. Archer Jr. while he was chief judge, and then for a bit while he was a senior judge. And so I also got to see a bit more of the administrative apparatus of the federal circuit. And so the experience day to day was fairly predictable. You get the beginning of the month, you would get the briefs for the upcoming oral arguments. You would begin to write your bench memos. The judge would distribute the cases amongst the clerks, and Judge Archer was pretty good at making sure we had a mix of patent cases and non-patent cases amongst my co-clerks. And then for every judge is a little bit different. Judge Archer, because he was the chief judge, was very, very busy with administrative work. So it made it sometimes more difficult to get in to discuss the cases. But when we prepared for oral arguments, so usually we'd meet the day before, he had dug into the weeds of those cases in ways that were amazing. His intellect, his ability to remember details of cases that I had 1/3 of the cases. At the time, there were 3 clerks per judge. He remembered details of every case and that I couldn't remember when I only had 1/3 of the course of the caseload, right? So, and for Judge Archer, we would write bench memos, but they were fairly short. He didn't want lengthy bench memos. Other judges, as clerks, they would basically draft an opinion as a bench memo. So if the judge was assigned the opinion was basically done. We flipped it around. And so we only drafted draft opinions if we were writing the decision. And that was a lot of the fun, right? We were given the opportunity to draft the first draft of the opinion, and then the judge would bleed all over it because it's his opinion, right? It's coming out in his voice. So that iterative process of draft, edit was great to learn how a writing style, right?
So,
go ahead.
I was going to ask, that's a really fascinating dynamic that you just described. How much of the end product would you say reflects your voice versus the judge's voice?
I would say it never reflected my voice. It was always the judge's because that's our role. But I think the amount of editing that took place declined over time, right? As I got to know the judge's voice, then I could draft the opinion knowing what he would want to say, what he would not want to say. And so towards the end, I would say of my clerkship, the editing came down quite a bit, but I was very careful to make sure it was never my voice, not my opinion. It was always working as the hand of the judge. And so I was always excited, don't get me wrong, that if I drafted an opinion that he lightly edited and it went out in that way, I was ecstatic, right? That I had written something that he viewed appropriate. And you take a little bit of ownership in what you've written, even though publicly it is the judge's. So I was always excited when that happened. But the focus is always his voice, what he wanted to say, particularly in some of the bigger cases.
And in the Court of Appeals, the Federal Circuit, there are 3 judges. If it's not en banc, typically 3 judges. And so to be in the majority, you need at least one other judge to go with you.
Correct.
To what extent are clerks involved in canvassing support from the clerks, at least, or the other judge in supporting the opinion of a particular judge?
For my judge, and I think this is the case, very little. Each chamber has strict confidentiality within the chambers. And so the clerks of the judges on the panel would get together to talk about cases, but not what their judge was thinking. It'd be if there was a factual issue or a technological issue we are trying to sort out, we'd talk about that. But generally speaking, the clerks were not involved in persuading the other judges. For Judge Archer, rarely, if ever, did he speak about a case with a judge before. And so for him, the first occasion to find out what the other panelists were thinking were generally at oral argument, where he would hear the questions. And that's part of when you watch the oral argument, it's a conversation amongst the judges as much as it is a conversation with the litigants. And so that's when the first time for him that he'd have an idea of what the other judges were thinking. And then they immediately take a straw vote after oral argument, right? And so that's when they assign the decision, and that's when he finds out what the other judges were thinking. Now, as the case goes along, the judges may talk to each other as opinions circulate and go around. There might be some persuasion. The clerks could be involved in writing a memo about something that the judge would circulate, but we never really went clerk to clerk very much. I will say on occasion, another judge would come talk to me, which was incredibly uncomfortable at times, right? To have one of the judges on the panel come talk to you because you have to protect the confidentiality of your judge, but you also want to be respectful to the other judge. So that did happen on occasion. I remember I was finishing up a run and one of the judges who was a runner at the time came to speak to me about something. I'm like, I'm tired, I'm sweaty, and I've got to maintain confidentiality for the chamber. So I have to walk a thin line here. Fortunately, the judge was gregarious about it. It wasn't like he was interrogating me. But that was the one time I'm like, I got to be careful here. So
talk about dissents, Tim. Have you worked with Judge Archer on dissents, and is the approach in injecting that part of the conversation in the judicial decision-making process different, and how is it different?
I did work on a number of dissents, although we're stretching my memory a little bit. This is quite a while ago. I think for him, there were two components to it. One is that if he felt strongly about an issue, he was going to make sure that he explained it and put it out there publicly, because downstream, maybe someone agrees with him, or there's an in-bank decision to take the issue in-bank to flip it, or he's trying to set something up for in-bank consideration. And it's also if the Supreme Court takes interest. Now, back when I clerked was a time when the Supreme Court generally was not interested in the federal circuit, although there were a few big cases. I clerked after Markman, but when Warner Jenkinson was taken, they had taken the Winstar cases from the Court of Federal Claims. So there were some big cases. So he did have an eye to the Supreme Court as well. At that time, I think, though, that was viewed as unlikely to happen in the most part. But a lot of it was if he felt passionate about an issue, he wanted to make sure his views were known. He was a tax attorney. He came to the court from the Department of Justice doing tax work. So those spaces, he had very particular views. And if something was not going the way that he liked, he was definitely going to voice his opinion.
So tell us about your journey after your time at the court. What happened after that?
Absolutely. So I always tell my students, my career is one of somewhat happy accidents. Because as I mentioned, I had no inclination to be an academic, was not on my radar. Lots of my law school classmates were thinking about being professors. So maybe that little seed was planted. So I was going to the federal circuit. I was going to go into practice. My co-clerk for the first year of my clerkship is the now Chief Judge Kimberly Moore of the Federal Circuit. At that time, she was going on the academic market. And so that planted the seed about, well, maybe I would want to be an academic. I just say that now to explain the next few steps in my career. So once she went to Chicago Kent initially, we kept in good touch. We're still good friends. So that sort of got me thinking about it. But I was going to practice and I had a lot of debt. So I wanted to go make some money at a law firm. But because Judge Archer went senior in the middle of the second year of my clerkship, because I had a 2-year clerkship, he said that if I wanted to leave early, he would let me do so. That way, the new clerks coming on board would have a little bit more opportunity. So I said that was great. In law school, I had taken my mother back to Budapest, Hungary. My family is Hungarian. And so I was kind of interested in Hungary. We loved the trip. I had never spent any significant time overseas. And I had made a connection through that Charlotte law firm. Again, never underestimate networking and connections with a Hungarian patent firm, Danubia. I had gone on vacation in Hungary around Thanksgiving. It must have been in 1997. And I was thinking about a Fulbright or some sort of opportunity. So I met at Danubia and they said, here's the office where you can sit if you'd like to come over and spend time working with us. And so I was rolling off my clerkship. I had accepted an offer with Wiley Ryan and Fielding, now Wiley Ryan in Washington, D.C. But part of my negotiation was getting them to pay for my health insurance so I could go live in Budapest for 6 months, working with Danubia, primarily helping them with their English, getting them to know American patent law a little bit better. And then also for me, learning a bit about Hungarian patent law. They were not part of the EPO quite yet. So at that point, and also learning Hungarian, traveling. So from March until August of 98, I lived in Budapest. Now, this is a somewhat challenging time because part of this narrative is also that I had not come out as an openly gay man until January of 1998. So I'm clerking, I'm wrestling with my sexual orientation. I told 6 people before I left, and all of them were thinking, why on earth are you moving to a foreign country where you don't speak the language? It may not be particularly receptive to gay people, but I convinced myself I had to do it. I would regret not taking this opportunity to live overseas. And so I did. So it made a very challenging 6 months. Wouldn't change it for the world. Loved it. But it was pretty grueling in a lot of ways too. And so when I came back from Budapest in August of 1998, I started to work at Wiley Ryan. I picked them because they had a very sophisticated patent practice, but a fairly small one. So I wanted to be able to hit the ground running, make some contributions. There weren't lots of federal circuit clerks there, so I figured that that would give me a leg up in sort of writing briefs, both at the district court and the appellate level. Wiley also had a very sophisticated appellate practice, general appellate practice. And so I really wanted the opportunity to work on some non-patent appellate work with some fantastic attorneys. And so I was able to do that. So that's what took me to Wiley Ryan.
Now, I'm glad you planted the flag on your work in the future at that point in time with the LGBTQ community. And that I think is quite remarkable, because most of us as law professors just stay as law professors and we stay within our field, but you go beyond that. And so that's something I want to talk about when we get to it.
Yeah.
But just looking at your time in Budapest and then in practice, how much of that do you think was formative and carried forward as you moved on in life?
It was formative in lots of different ways. I think the Budapest experience opened my eyes to different cultures. Not that Hungarian culture is strikingly different than American culture in some ways, but I was in a space where I didn't understand the language. By the time I left, I could understand probably about 20 to 30% of what I heard. Hungarian is not a language you become fluent in 6 months. Everyone laughed when I told them that was my goal. So it gave me an appreciation of being in a space where I couldn't understand everything going on, appreciating the way that the cultures were different, the ways that they were similar. At that time, Hungary was becoming more westernized in terms of its work ethic, which is good and bad, right? In some ways, they were very like, no, you leave the office at 5 o'clock and you can't take files home with you. And so you basically worked 9 to 5. And so the work-life balance was a lot better there in some regards. But being alone, wrestling with my sexual orientation, somewhat isolated, although I did develop some good friendships over there, and traveling a lot. I traveled all throughout Central and Eastern Europe, just opened my eyes, right? I'm a small town kid from rural Ohio. And I'd been overseas once before, took my mom to Hungary, spent some time in England. So that really boosted my confidence, let me know that I can take some chances and take some risks and life will go on. There is growth and discomfort. And so I think that personally, the Budapest experience was very transformative for me in that regard, which then was the springboard to do some of the things I do downstream, where it's sort of like, well, I don't know if I'm going to be good at this, but I should try it. Why not? And I will say, I have a very strong cohort of friends from my college years that are like, they are my people to this day, that were very supportive through all of this. When I came out to them, they were supportive, because I think that's part of the coming out experience that it's hard to for people to appreciate, particularly in the late 90s, is that you don't know who's going to stick by your side. I think people are better about it now, but that risk of losing friendships, losing family members, because you're simply being honest with who you are, is a very grueling and stressful experience.
Was that something which manifested in a material way to you personally, losing friends and family members, and did these people come around eventually?
Yeah, I was very fortunate in that my family was incredibly supportive. My family is very, very Catholic. My mother never attended a non-Catholic institution all the way through her master's degree. My dad similarly was all the way through undergraduate at Catholic institutions. So I was nervous, and I'm the youngest of 5. So you wonder how your siblings are going to react. My sister was one of the first people I told, because I knew she had at the time a brother-in-law who was openly gay. So I knew she wouldn't care. So, and I didn't tell them all at once, right? I did the classic coming out story at Thanksgiving, right? Hey, go ruin Thanksgiving, somewhat tongue in cheek. So I told my parents after I got back from Hungary, and I told my oldest 2 brothers the following year, because my parents didn't want a secret in the family. I was fortunate. My friends all stood by me. My family was very supportive. It took my parents a little bit of time to sort of come to grips with it. So there was okay, Tim's gay. So what does that mean, particularly as a Catholic? And then the first time I started dating someone was another sort of moment, like, oh, now we've got to really think about what this means. Like, Tim's going to be bringing a same-sex partner home. What does that mean? And how does that map on to Catholic tradition? So there was that growth. There was one moment I remember my sister called and said, Mom's praying that you'll go straight. So because I'm I confront. I don't view confrontation as negative. I immediately called up my mom. I'm like, Mom, Lisa tells me you're praying that I'll be straight. She's like, no, I just want you to be happy. I was like, Mom, I am being honest with who I am for the first time in my life. I am happy. So you should be happy for me. And so we had a great conversation. And then I got off the phone and immediately my sister called me back. I can't believe you called Mom and told you I told her. I'm like, of course I was going to call Mom when you told. So I was fortunate. My oldest brothers came around quickly. In fact, my second oldest brother, Mike, this is somewhat inappropriate, but because it's my brother and I love him, I understood what he was saying. He's like, oh, so there's something wrong with you, because I was always the academically successful one in the family. He was not as strong academically. And so he's like, oh, there's something wrong with you. There's nothing wrong. He didn't mean it that way, but I knew what he meant. Like, oh, you're not who we expected in a good way. So I've been very fortunate. I've been with my now husband for 17 years. They've done nothing but embrace him. In fact, I think they like him better than me sometimes.
What would you have said to that younger version of yourself in Hungary when you were struggling, at that point in time around Thanksgiving when you were deciding whether or not to come out? What would you have said to yourself?
I think I would have said, one, don't worry, but two, you need to be prepared for who you want to be. So for me, the struggle was far more internal, because I was Catholic, right? And I internalized that fear of, like, according to Catholic doctrine, I am intrinsically disordered and sinning if I ever engage in a relationship with a man. And so that's hard. And it really is debilitating to your self-esteem. Now, I will say, I think part of my academic success was me overcompensating for being gay and trying to hide it for a long period of time. So I threw myself into my academic work, which had its own complications, that my self-identity and esteem was so tied up in academic performance that the thought of getting a B horrified me, right? So I would have told myself, chill out a little bit, right? You'll be okay if you don't get an A, and it will be okay going forward. That there are, for my own religious, I still identify as Christian, right? In my mind, a God of love could not create people on this earth who are by definition denied love, right? That you must live a celibate life, that you cannot engage in a relationship with, right? To me, that doesn't make any sense. I wish I had understood that sooner. But then also said, your family's going to be fine. But in some ways, I don't know that I would have changed my path, because I'm really happy with where I am. And so you never know, right? Had I come out earlier, would I not have been academically as successful, because I would have done, sort of been distracted, or, but I do wish I would have told myself to be a little bit easier on myself, because it was grueling internally. And I was fortunate enough that once I came to grips with who I was, then I didn't care as much what other people thought. It was still scary, right? Particularly family and close friends. But at the end of the day, if I met somebody in a plane and, they found out I was gay, what do I care, right? They don't like me, that's their problem, not my problem. So it was much more for me about the internal acceptance than worrying about what others had to say, excluding like really close friends. Like if I had lost my parents, which do happen to a lot of LGBTQ plus people, that would have been devastating. I would have moved on and been okay with it, but it would have been really, really painful.
Talk about the additional step that you took. You came to terms with yourself, with your family, with your friends. But in addition to that, anybody looking at your profile page will see Tim Holbrook, law professor. At that point in time, you were vice provost, and so you were doing all those other things related to that too. But you were also recognized and had contributed a substantial amount of writing and speaking on this LGBTQ cause. What motivated you to do that?
The initial impetus was the era before marriage equality and trying to get marriage equality to the Supreme Court. And so formally, I was in this op-ed project, which teaches you how to do public writing. But what motivated me was thinking sort of what you just said, right? That I'm a tenured law professor. I'm also a white male. So I have a lot of privilege. I may be gay, but I have a lot of privilege. And so if anyone's going to speak out about these issues, it needs to be me, because the consequences for speaking out they can be significant. I've had death threats, right? But I'm not going to lose my job. I have tenure. I'm at an institution that, while all institutions can get better, we're going to be supportive of me speaking out on these issues. And so it really was that I felt that I had something to say. If not me, then who? And that notwithstanding, some death threats, which I never took terribly seriously, the negative consequences for me were not going to be as extreme as it might be for someone else who's just not in the position of privilege that I have. And so that led me to start thinking about these issues and speaking about them. And the big culmination was when I worked with another patent attorney, actually, John Dragseth, who's in Minneapolis, who I clerked with. And we worked with professional football players writing an amicus brief in support of marriage equality at the Supreme Court. That sort of was my springboard. It was kind of an interesting and fun way to become an advocate in this space, and using the NFL players' voices in a way that was where we're not going to make groundbreaking legal arguments. It was really to draw attention to it. So I think that was sort of my first toe in the pool, and then getting the formal op-ed training, learning how to write op-eds, immersing myself in the work. And I had done the work on the ground at Emory. I had advocated before marriage equality to change our domestic partner benefits because I thought they were inequitable. Even at Chicago Kent, when we were in the don't ask, don't tell era, I had some debates and disagreements with the administration about whether we should be welcoming the armed forces. I can't remember what court it was, but there was a judicial body of the military coming to campus, and there not even been a conversation about whether that was appropriate or not. And so I kind of pushed on that. I was probably on the fence about it, but to me, it's like, but we should be talking about this, not just doing it. So I've always had a bit of a chip on my shoulder in that regard, in good ways. And I want to make sure that the spaces I operate are inclusive with respect to queer people, but all forms of diversity and inclusion as well.
So let's talk about that for a moment. These days, when we talk about DEI, it's really taken off. It's, I think, grown in acceptance. Has it diluted, you think, the focus on gay people? And are gay people's interests really different from DEI more generally, which, for lack of a better word, has become diluted by this broader debate about DEI?
I think that the LGBTQ community are part of that conversation because, historically our relationships have been criminalized. Even to this day, in many places, you can be fired for being gay, right? So I'm married on Saturday and fired on Monday, right? And so part of the DEI dynamic, which I think it is, are creating spaces at the table for marginalized communities, for those communities where society has worked to keep them in down and fire. Then we are part of that conversation, right? When you throw on the intersection of identities, right? When you start thinking about how trans women of color, the violence against them is such a disproportionately high. When you start thinking about the ways that race and gender and sexual orientation intersect, then I think it definitely has to be part of the conversation because you can't just sort of take this part out of someone's lived experience, right? So I think it's part of it. It's a little bit more challenging, I think, in some ways, at least if you're thinking more of a compliance dynamic, that for federal purposes, there are very formal ways that we think about race, we think about gender, and we have measurements for those in ways that we don't have for the queer community. So one issue always people talk about, it sounds quota-ish, which I push back on, but right, well, how many are enough, right, to be satisfied that we're diverse enough? And that's a harder question to answer for the LGBTQ plus community, because we don't really know what our numbers are, because there's not really been a systemic way of measuring that. So when you look at affirmative action hiring goals for universities, they tend to be race and gender specific because those data are available. So I think it operates a little bit differently. We've got to
do queer people, though, actually want to be a statistic that says, okay, maybe eventually, as part of hiring processes, we will take that into account. But before that happens, you need to have more people coming and identifying themselves in that way and feeling comfortable with that.
So I think so. I'll flip it a little bit. When I first was thinking about moving to Emory, I was leaving Chicago Kent, which had a very robust queer faculty, and it was clearly an inclusive place. And so when I was considering the move to Emory, I looked for the signals, right? So how many openly LGBTQ faculty are there at the law school? What are the structures to support queer people at Emory? And so I think the answer is yes, because when I first arrived at Emory, it was the first time I really experienced the critical mass problem. So there was myself and one other openly gay faculty member, but he tended to be away a lot. His partner lived outside of Atlanta. And there was another faculty member who was not particularly out. And so it became me. And that can be really isolating, right? That gave me some empathy for the idea that you need to have, more people around. And so to answer your question, I think the answer is yes, in part because no one wants to be alone. And the only way that we can make sure that we have a community is if we self-identify. And I think, I know like a place like Emory, we've been having this conversation for a long time, allowing people to self-identify. And I think we're at an inflection point where 20 years ago, people didn't want to self-identify for fear of being fired, right? That they weren't confident that their employer would value their sexual orientation or gender identity. I feel that for the most part, not everywhere, but the most part, that's changed. And the way I think about it is, we should give people the option to self-identify. If for some reason they're afraid of discrimination, they won't. And that's fine. But if for someone who, like me, it is important to be able to formally let my employer know, look, I'm a gay man, then I should be able to have that option.
Do you feel, whether at the law school at Emory or at the university level as vice provost, that you were in a position to effect these types of policies that would make it more friendly to non-conventional people, whether queer or otherwise, to be able to self-identify and to be part of that conversation?
Absolutely. At the law school, I really worked to make sure that we were considering what pronouns students wanted to use and what names they wanted to use. We were sort of pushed a bit in a good way by one of our first openly trans students, who actually, he was in an HBO documentary as well. So it was kind of fascinating. And so I helped lead a lot of those conversations about why it's important to use the proper pronouns and why it's important to use the names that they have given. And so I think that helped quite a bit. As vice provost, I did a lot of work and outreach to the LGBTQ community because since we don't have a formal way to identify, it's hard to pull that community together. And so I did a lot of outreach, harder during the pandemic, but a lot of outreach to do so. And I've been agitating for a while to allow our HR system to self-identify. We aren't there yet, but Emory is implementing a new infrastructure for faculty data that I was involved with, and I made it crystal clear that we need to allow people in that system to self-identify. I think it'll go fully online next year, so it better be the case we're allowed to self-identify. So yeah, I was, and I was an advocate. Not to say that I was an advocate in excluding other dynamics too, for inclusion, but those formal processes, yes, I think I was a very vocal person. I think I moved the ball.
Do you feel that as scholars, we tend to like to take the safe, narrow lane? And if you are in physics, you do physics. If you're in law, you do law. And you don't really think, as you have done, and as you have now become known for, social causes within the context of the scholarly community and beyond. Should we be trying to replicate and produce more Tim Holbrooks in other areas, whether as leaders of the queer community or other causes?
I think I always push back a little bit about the should we. I think we should be creating spaces for people that think this is of interest to them to allow them to do it and not view them negatively, right? Fortunately, for me, there's somewhat of an alignment between law and advocacy, right? In a way that maybe a physicist doesn't have. But clearly interests of inclusion are important in physics and the sciences and right everywhere. And so I would like to think that we would create a space for people to do that work. I think they are doing that work in lots of ways. I think, thinking about, I'm going to get the name wrong, but Neil deGrasse, the physicist, right, who talks about the importance of being inclusive and allowing a more diverse set of physicists and STEM folks. And we're seeing a little bit more of that in formal research in areas like public health. I saw quite a bit of that. The NIH is beginning to support this type of work about how do we make these spaces more inclusive. So I would never say should, because I don't want to normatively suggest one way is right or the other. But I do think that there's a need for voices in all disciplines. And the question is, how do we get those voices elevated and make sure that they aren't punished in some way for what they do? Because speaking out as a physicist about these issues, you may not be doing your core research. And so pre-tenure, if you're on a faculty, that could be a challenge. And I think we need to make sure that we value that work in different spaces in ways that I don't know that we do quite yet.
Let's talk about that core research, because one thing that you have done, even sticking within your lane, is to make your scholarship relevant, whether it's speaking to the courts and the briefs that you file, or op-eds, and or the mainstream media that do come to you and ask you for your views. How do you develop that reputation and that expertise, and why that level of engagement?
I think it's generally an evolution. I think for me, and maybe it's the engineering background, I've always wanted my work to have relevance beyond the academy. Clearly, I want to speak to other academics. That's a lot of the fun. But I also want to see what I'm advocating actually do something, hopefully. And so it was always intriguing to me to have those conversations. And I do think, at least in patent law, and maybe intellectual property more generally, the divide between practice and theory is not nearly as wide as it is in other areas, right? When you think about why the patent system operates and the incentive structure, like that's theoretical. And so I think the intellectual property bar is more receptive to having academics as well. And so, but I think I'll take it a little bit broader if I can, because I think it tells the whole story. I've always wanted to be engaged with the intellectual property community, not just IP scholars. So when I was at Chicago Kent, having worked with the Inn of Court, Giles Rich Inn of Court in DC, Judge Lynn had approached me and others about starting Inn of Court there. And so for me, that was important to be a part of that community, even as a scholar, and to have those conversations with practitioners. And so for me, I've always thought that relationship was clear. And so if they were finding value in what I was writing, I was happy to share it with them, right? And so I think that's where it really started, is I always wanted to be engaged with the community, the practicing bar, for my own purposes, for my students' purposes, right? Like I had a colleague who will remain anonymous, like, why do you go speak to bar events? I'm like, so that they know that Emory is out there and producing fantastic intellectual property graduates, you're right. And if it promotes my scholarship, big plus too, but why wouldn't I do that? And so that's part of the dynamic. And then I think starting to write the amicus briefs came about when I realized that issues I'm talking about are getting up to the Supreme Court. And so it's like, well, here's a chance to actually have that impact given what I've written. The sort of media dynamic, I think it was in part when I started doing LGBTQ op-ed writing, I also started doing a little bit more about IP and the patent system, and realizing that these issues may seem esoteric to most folks, but in fact, lots of what we deal with in the patent system has a pretty immediate and important impacts on the general population. And so how do we talk about that in a way that the public can understand it? I think as an academic, obviously, I have my viewpoints, but I feel that I can be a little bit more objective because I'm not worried about protecting a particular commercial interest. And so that translation could be a little bit more objective to the general public. And from that, then you get the inquiries from the general media. And of course, Emory cultivates that too, right? They'll get it, we're looking for an expert to talk about this issue. And I'm like, okay, I'll talk about it. Why not? So there, I think it's sort of a little bit of an evolution, some feedback that the more you do it, more people see you, the more they contact you.
Let's talk about institutionalizing progress. You started the Inn of Court in Chicago. When you went to Atlanta, you started the Inn of Court too. You've done that work trying to engage, I'm sure, both at the law school level and at the university level, the changes that you have instituted and that you hope others can build on. How do you think about making change, but at the same time keeping that change in place on the right track once you're gone?
I think the way that you achieve it, and this is just my leadership style, is to be very collaborative and to make sure that you get the buy-in from everybody else. That can make it slow, right? Because in some ways it's easier if you're like a dean or a provost or president, you say do X, boom, you expect it to be implemented. But I think those are the times that if you don't do the legwork to understand what other stakeholders are thinking, why they may resist, that's when your change doesn't have legs, right? Because you don't have the buy-in. People will just wait out the leadership change because it's inevitably going to come. And so my approach has always been to work from the ground with everybody, ground up, never make it about myself, right? It's about how do we improve the institution, be it starting an in of core, be it implementing best practices for inclusive hiring. And then, I think I was, particularly with the inner court in Atlanta, a pretty good first leader. And I feel this way a little bit with the vice provost position. I was the first vice provost for faculty affairs at Emory. I think a healthy part of leadership is realizing when it's time to let go too, whether it's for internal personal reasons, you're burned out, tired, but more importantly, external, that you've done what you can with this organization. You've done what you can with this change. And if you've done the work to get the buy-in, then when you transition to somebody new, they can actually take it even higher, right? And I felt that way with the Inn of Court. I really did a lot of work in Chicago with the Linen, a lot of work at the Atlanta IP Inn of Court. And when I rolled off as being president and past president, I still stayed engaged, but I let go. Right? It's not mine anymore. Let's see what people can do. And I'm amazed at what the Inn of Court has done. It's far surpassed anything that I could have done over the long period of time.
Let me ask you this, because it seems almost like a catch-22. If you do your job right, you love doing what you do, you get that buy-in. You're going to enjoy your job even more because that's the fruits of your labor, right?
Yeah.
But then at the same time, you are saying there is a time that I need to realize that my job is done. I need to step down.
Yeah.
How do you know when that time comes? Because most people step down because they're hitting their head against the wall, not when things are going well.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of navel gazing that goes into it. And so some of it's internal motivation. And some of it's about why are you doing the work to begin with? I've always been an institutionalist, right? That do benefits come when being in these positions? Yes, but I'm always uncomfortable with some of the benefit. Like I sent an email to Emory Healthcare recently to complain about something I wasn't happy about, didn't think about the title, and immediately it got escalated, right? I was like, oh, whoops, I forget that dynamic sometimes. But I think if you're an institutionalist, you have to realize that you can see when things are getting stale, right? That my ideas have been implemented, they've been great, but to take it to the next level requires some new breath. And you can try and do that by who you put around you in some ways, right? Continually having some new voices, making sure things are, but for me, I could just tell that both I was getting a little bit stale, like my ideas, what's next. I was also a little tired, right? Because it is a lot of work to get from A to B, and to go from B to C, it's sort of like, do I have that energy to do it? So I think those two feed off of each other. But if you get trapped, if you get caught up in the trappings of a position, that can be dangerous, right? And maybe as being from small town Ohio, being the youngest of five, I've never taken myself that seriously. And so for me, it's been fairly easy to say, like, I think my successor can take this to a new level, and I'm ready for a new challenge, right? And in some sense, I'm not growing in this position anymore. So I need to go on and do something new to continue to grow. Or go back, like now being an academic again, but taking on a new challenge, like writing a book, right? Just finding, and that's, I think the definition of my life has been, what's the next challenge that can help me grow at the most general level?
Yeah, take us through your mind on December 1st of last year. That was the last day you were vice provost.
Yeah.
You had done what you felt that you could do. And anybody looking at your profile page would see in the first sentence the words "One Emory engaged for impact" are there, which must have been a defining part of your tenure as vice provost. So talk about that, some of the ups, some of the downs. What were your takeaways?
Yeah, I mean, I learned a lot. I think one important lesson in leadership is realizing that even if you're good at something doesn't mean it rewards you personally. So that is part of my stepping away story. Is I think I was a really good vice provost for faculty affairs, and that sounds horribly arrogant. But it was not feeding my soul as much as I would have liked. Now I'll go back and explain it, because I am a hands-on person. When I was associate dean of faculty, I liked working with faculty to make sure that they're moving towards tenure or moving towards promotion, talking about scholarship, but I was in the dirt. And as vice provost for faculty affairs, I was very excited to work on faculty development, but I would start a program that someone else would implement. And so for me, psychologically, I didn't feel that benefit. I didn't feel that I had made an impact. But what I did feel was I call it faculty behaving badly, right? Because a lot of my work was also dealing with faculty misconduct or faculty conflict. And that's what I saw up front. So for me, there was an asymmetry that made it more difficult. But I'll step back to when I first started in 2018. And I was hired by Provost White McBride, who's now the president of the new school. And I was really enthusiastic about his vision for Emory, right? And I could buy into it. I was going to be the first vice provost of faculty affairs. He really wanted to create a robust faculty culture. And I knew President Claire Sturt, I knew as well. She came up through the ranks at Emory. So I was very excited. That first year was when we launched One Emory, the strategic framework. And so we had 4 pillars. A big part of that was research, scholarship, and faculty. So it was coming on to my lab. We were building out my office. So I'm trying to work on a strategic plan while creating a new office to have resources to do what we needed to do. So it's a very steep learning curve. The law school is the second smallest unit at Emory. We're not funded by extramural funding. So I had to learn the cultures of the other units as well, right? And so there was a very steep learning curve. But I also came to have a healthy appreciation for the fantastic work going on at Emory. I'm like, how did I get here? How did they hire me here? Because everyone was just so impressive. So that first year was really getting the legs underneath the strategic framework, responding to things that we wanted to do on inclusion. And so it was exhausting, but it was very inspiring and fun.
Did you feel like you were getting pushback because there was no predecessor? You were the first person in the job. You were interfacing with the different schools, the different departments. They didn't know why you were there.
Well, they
had
did
to sort of carve it out and explain to them, here's why you need to listen to me.
Yeah, there was a predecessor-ish. So there was a vice provost for academic affairs, which was sort of like deputy provost. It was both students and faculty. So I was the first faculty-focused vice provost. So there was something there, but I think they were kind of wondering, what is this position going to be? And my goal was to make my office a service center, right? To make the provost's office look fantastic and flawless as possible, and to make sure that we were serving the deans and associate deans of faculty and the faculty. So that was the service model that I brought to the office. And so when I would do things like convene the Council of Associate Deans of Faculty, which my office did, when I was associate dean, I found those meetings to be annoying to go to. And I'm like, why am I here? And I didn't feel like we had created a team amongst the associate deans. And so when I started running those meetings, that was my goal, right? Like, let's make this a collaborative space where I can bring ideas and problems to you. You can bring ideas and problems to me. And as a collective, we can talk about them and find solutions. And if we disagree, we can do it constructively. And so I really worked to make that group in particular a coherent partnership. And as I was rotating out of the vice provost role, I heard from many of the associate deans that they valued that change, that they felt the change, that they really felt that the other associate deans across campus were collaborators and partners, someone that they could contact to deal with something. And so I think that helped, that by having that service mentality to make sure that this was not Tim said so dictation, right? It was either let's think about the problem and work at it together, or if I was having to implement something that we're just saying because that's how it is, that I was very transparent on the why. I wasn't just saying do X, saying do X because of Y and Z, right? I try to be incredibly transparent with our reasoning in a way that I don't think had happened before. I don't know if it was intentional or if it was, I think it was more a capacity issue because there just wasn't time. So that was my approach, and I do feel like it worked well. I loved the Council of Associate Deans. I actually enjoyed having our meetings. Usually we try and have a happy hour with them at the end of each semester to thank them for all the work that they did. That was a fun group, which is a weird thing to say in some ways.
Talk about managing up. You talked about managing down with the associate deans. Who did you report to, and how did you make sure that that relationship was a good, functioning, healthy one?
So formally, I reported, my immediate direct report was the deputy provost, although that position she has since left to become the dean of UVA's College of Arts and Sciences and grad school. And so that position title has changed to senior vice provost. And then I had a dotted line to the provost. So formally, the provost was who could fire me, but day to day, it was a deputy provost. And my style has always just been frank and direct, not rude, right? And confrontational sounds like it's got such a negative connotation, but I don't think it should. Like, I just confront. If there's something I don't like, or if there's something I don't understand, then I simply address it in a way that is, I think, considered, right? I'm not going to offer a knee-jerk reaction, but I'm also going to express my views. And so with the deputy provost, fortunately, we tended to agree on lots of stuff, and we aligned in lots of ways, and our styles were similar. But that was it. If there's something I didn't like, I just said, I don't like this. I disagree with it. And we'd have a conversation, and maybe I could persuade her or not. And this would happen with the provost at times too, or maybe not. Importantly, if I lost the conversation, if my view was not accepted, then I let it go. Right. So that for me was important, to manage up, to make sure I was frank, honest, transparent, but they had confidence that I was going to implement what they said, and I wasn't going to undermine them because I disagreed. And I think that's an important lesson to learn, that know when the fight's over, because at some point you have a job. My job was to implement the mission of the provost and the deputy provost. And if the decision was made, then I need to implement it and not undermine it. I think with the most recent because I served under 3 provosts, if you include the interim. That's part of my story about my time as vice provost. I had a little bit more direct conversations with the current provost, particularly as it related to promotion and tenure. And it was a similar dynamic. And he knew this. If he wanted to implement a change to our process, either I would give him the pros and cons if I really was indifferent, which does happen sometimes. Like, here's the pros, here's the cons. Your decision. But if there was something I did feel strongly about, then I would advocate. I said, like, well, realize if you do X, these are the consequences that are going to flow, or you're going to stir the hornet's nest over here because they're worried about something. And so I would suggest you don't do that. Sometimes you win those arguments, sometimes you don't. And I think I just had to accept that. And if you can't accept losing at times, then you're really going to struggle as an administrator and as any kind of leader, because you don't always win.
How important is mentorship to you, whether as somebody who has received mentorship or is giving mentorship?
Receiving mentorship, I mean, I love mentoring people. So from that side is again, that hands-on dynamic. And so for me, it's like teaching, right? It is a way of helping other people develop and discover who they want to be and maximizing their potential. For me, helping facilitate that for someone is incredibly rewarding. I really enjoy, I'm at the stage in the academic side of my career where people who I mentored early on are now, full professors at top 15 law school, right? They've gone well beyond me, and I love seeing that, right?
And that's a sign of a good mentor.
I hope. It's up to them, right? Hopefully my mentorship was do the exact opposite of what Tim did, and you'll be successful. I don't want that. But so mentoring people to me is life-giving, right? Literally. For me, receiving mentorship is really important. The best advice I've always heard is to have a diverse portfolio of mentors, right? Those who are super senior in your field, those who are peers. It's important, particularly for marginalized communities, to have mentors who are within your community, but also mentors who are outside of your community to help navigate those spaces. So I had a lot of queer mentors who could help when I was encountering some challenging issues related to LGBTQ status. but also those who are just about helping me with my scholarship. And I think I've lucked out particularly, and hopefully you experience this, that the intellectual property academic community is incredibly welcoming, even as it has ballooned, right? So when I started in 2000, I went to the very first intellectual property scholars conference ever. There were about 16 of us around a table. That, as you know, there's now over 100, maybe 200 people at that conference. Right? So our community—
It's a convention now.
Yeah, our community has exploded,
Yeah.
but by and large, that mentoring collaborative spirit has sustained, right? I remember the first time that I sent something to Mark Lemley to review, thinking he was going to think I'm an idiot. And he gave me incredibly helpful feedback. I remember having a conversation with Rochelle Dreyfus. She had come to speak at Chicago Kent, and she was good friends with Graham Dinwiddie at Chicago Kent, who's also a very important mentor to me, both IP and in the LGBTQ space. And I was nervous, right? Rochelle's like, what are you working on? And for me, that was like paralyzing, right? I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm going to say what I'm working on. I'm going to think I'm an idiot. And so I laid out what I was thinking about, and what she's like, well, that's impressive. You know, when I wrote my first article, I really wasn't certain what the next article would be. So I exhaled to know that there is not a monolithic approach to being an academic, and that everybody's path's a little bit different. And the intellectual property community is one where they will support you and help you grow. Ultimately, they'll have to make assessments of your tenure, but they want everyone to be successful. So I do think folks like Mark Lemley, Graham Dinwiddie have been important for me as an IP scholar. Christopher Leslie, who's antitrust IP intersection, they're both at Chicago Kent. I remember them sitting down and having a very frank conversation with me about one of my articles, basically saying, the ideas are great. This is terribly written. You cannot send it out in this form. And it was perfect, because then I completely overhauled the piece. And at the time, it ended up being one of my best placed pieces. So I think for me, receiving mentorship is important. And how you define mentorship is different too. I think a lot of the work I've done in the DEI space has been through being mentored by people, even if maybe they didn't think of it as formal mentoring, by just simply listening and understanding other people's experiences, and then trying to be empathetic and realizing, like, that's not my experience. My experience is different. Their experience is as legitimate as mine. So don't immediately discount what they're going through because you didn't experience it. So I think a lot of that work has been through mentorship, maybe a bit more peer-to-peer, less junior to senior. For me, that's been invaluable, right? Small town Ohio kid where the entire community was white. I didn't have a perspective, even going to college. And so I just had to be able to open my eyes and listen and learn, and not just assume and project.
Has there been one person that has stood up from the others in saying, this is that one person that has helped define me and help me become who I am today?
The answer is no. I really think I've taken in a lot. If I had to see who has had the most impact professionally, personally, wow, it's really hard because there's so many just different facets. I mean, so Graham Dinwiddie and Christopher Leslie were crucial at my time at Chicago Kent. I would not be a successful academic if they had not been there. Chief Judge Moore opened the door to Chicago Kent, right? And she's been a great friend and mentor as well. She put me in touch with Chicago Kent. That's how I met them and got that first job. And at Emory, and particularly in the DEI space, I'd say Dorothy Brown, who is now at Georgetown, a great friend, someone who taught me a ton about best practices for inclusive hiring, and someone who would also hold me accountable. And we had an explicit agreement, right? That I was like, I'm going to do something stupid. I have no doubt. So please tell me when I do that so that I can improve. I won't be defensive. I'll just be mortified that I did it, right? And we had a similar dynamic with LGBTQ issues, right? That she knew that she may not get something in that space, and I would give her the grace to make mistakes, and we could talk about it. And so for me, Dorothy was transformative at my time at Emory. And so I would put those all on the top of the list. And they're more somewhat senior to but they've evolved to peer-to-peer relationships too. So I think that's one thing about mentoring too, is that the relationship evolves. It doesn't stay static if you're a good mentor.
Last question. Looking ahead, you've closed the chapter, Vice Provost Faculty Affairs. What should we be looking out for and expecting from Tim Holbrook in the next chapter?
That's a great question. I think in the near term, it's going to be some reflection and relaxation. As you know, I've moved to Denver, and so I imagine I'll be on a lot of long bike rides and hikes to sort of focus myself a little bit more. I think being administrator, I called it administrator brain, because everything comes at you from so many different angles that it's really hard to just concentrate on one thing. So I want to use this period of sabbatical to catch my breath, recover some physical health as well. And then the next stage is writing my book, right? And so I need to
tell us about that book, just a teaser.
Yeah, so the book is Patents, Property, and Possession. It takes my theory of why we have the enablement requirement in patent law and relates it to possession theory in the real property context. And I think if you think about how enablement is so pervasive in patent law, it's really not about the teaching function. It's not about how patents provide technical information. It's really about communicating possession of the invention in a way that affects public notice. And so I've written 4 articles on this topic. And so this is taking those 4 articles, synthesizing them into a little bit more coherent theory. As you know, writing articles, there's an odd path dependency. And you're like, oh, I should probably put that in the first article. I get to do that now. But then also extrapolating. And I'm really trying to synthesize most of my work, because for any form of if we think of enablement and possession as a form of communication to third parties, then you have to know about the audience. Who are so my work with Mark Janis on audience, I see folding into it. So I'm really trying to synthesize almost all of my scholarship into my grand opus. It's a different style of writing. I've never written a book before, so that's exciting. Otherwise, I do look forward to getting back into the academic community. Never say never to administrative work, but at this moment in time, I'm not seeking administrative opportunities. I'm really looking forward to the intellectual engagement with my peers and hopefully mentoring some up-and-coming IP scholars, writing this book, and then hopefully writing another book that's sort of the culmination of all my work on extraterritoriality too.
Your second magnum opus.
Yes, exactly.
And I wish you every success. I'm sure I speak on behalf of many in the IP community and beyond. Say thank you for all the work that you've done over the years, your leadership, and we look forward to seeing you around much more in the time.
I'm looking forward to that too, and I'm glad to hear that people are looking forward to having me around. That's for them to decide. So I'm looking forward to seeing everybody else.
Well, Tim Holbrook, thank you so much for joining us in Profiles for Leadership.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.